Hi everyone, I'm Tally, this is Farrell, and we are bored of it. And welcome to our buyer's guide for Dune Imperium, one of the hottest properties in board gaming of the last few years. If you're here, maybe you're wondering what the hell is Dune Imperium Uprising? Or maybe you're just thinking about what the differences are between the two versions of the game. Or maybe you're considering whether you should get the expansions, but you're wondering how compatible they are with either version of the game. Well, worry not, we've got you covered. We'll talk you through the history of Dune Imperium, how it plays, the differences, and tell you about the expansions and how they fit into it all. And then we'll tell you what we think of it all.
So, if you haven't seen one of our buyer's guides before, welcome. We like to cover situations like this where it might be a bit confusing, and we try to keep it mostly factual until the end where we give our opinion, just so you get the information you need to know what to buy or what's best for you. So we're going to timestamp all these little segments so you can jump to what's relevant for you, say if you already have Dune and you just want to know about the expansions, or if you just want to know what we think. And it would really help us if you would consider subscribing, if you find this helpful or informative. This time we didn't work with a publisher to make this, but a lot of times we do, and these kind of videos are only possible, sometimes with help because of the big amounts of content needed. And having subscribers really helps with that. And most importantly, you can always just comment down below if you end up having any questions or want anything clarified. And finally, think about checking us out on Threads, because now we're there as well. Board of It Reviews. Dune Imperium for 1 to 4 players from designer Paul Denon and publisher Direwolf arrived in late 2020 as a strategic deck building worker placement mashup, as was the style at the time. In part, it was a tie-in with the at that time upcoming Dune movie, using art based on the movie. Pretty much an instant smash hit, it has barreled up the Board Game Geek Top 100, and it is currently in 7th place at time of writing. Everything went quiet until 2022, which saw the release of 2 expansions, The Rise of Ix and Immortality, which were both very well received. In 2023, there was then the announcement and release of Dune Imperium Uprising, an updated standalone version of Dune Imperium with several updates to gameplay and based a little more on the upcoming Dune Part 2 movie. It has a player count of 1 to 4 players, along with a special 6-player team mode.
Dune Imperium is quite simply a race to 10 VP. For the majority of games, this will be the end game trigger, and whoever has the most VP at the end of the round this is triggered will win. Otherwise, the game will end after 10 rounds. Each round plays out the same way and starts with players drawing 5 cards from their deck into their hands. Players then take it in turns to send agents out to worker placement spaces, with the twist being that they also have to play a card from their hand that has a matching symbol to the space they want to send them. Many of the cards also have, when played, trigger effects, so then players can take the action on the board or trigger the effect on the card in either order. Once out of agents, players will reveal, showing any cards that they didn't play. Cards have a secondary effect at the bottom of the card, which triggers when revealed. Many of the cards will have persuasion, which is used to then buy new cards, or maybe they'll have combat points. Combat is a huge part of Dune Imperium, with players being able to send troops into battle to fight over victory points and rewards. In short, the player with the most strength will win the battle, but combat points can also come from intrigue cards and reveal turns, so there can always be surprises. VP comes from a variety of sources: winning a battle, gaining influence of the different factions, which is essentially moving up some tracks, board cards, and intrigue cards. Intrigue cards are fun little secret cards which have all types of effects on them, which shake up the game and the combat. This is a tense, tight strategic race where you have to work hard for every point you get, and building a good deck is crucial to that. It also gets tighter the more players you have, because you can't send your workers or agents to the same spaces where other players also have their agents. So, what's the difference between the 2 variations? Well, in terms of core gameplay, not a lot. You're still going to be drawing 5 cards from your deck into your hand every round. you're still going to be using those cards to send agents to worker placement spaces, and you're still racing for 10 VP. However, there are some subtle and some not so subtle changes to some mechanisms. Most of the available action spaces do remain the same, with only a few being swapped out for entirely new actions, while some others are just simply tweaked. The starting deck is also exactly the same, but the cards that you can purchase from the market are different, as is the Intrigue deck. We will also note that Dune Imperium is far more take that, with Intrigue and Imperium cards having far more ways to affect other players, say preventing them from going to a space or removing their troops from combat. Something new, mechanistically, are the spies, which are tokens you can place on the spaces on the main board to allow yourself to go there if somebody else has already claimed the spot, making that tight worker placement from the original that bit less harsh. There's also an optional module involving contracts, which we're sure everybody will play with. Essentially, you'll pick up contracts along the way that get fulfilled when you go to certain spaces, and when you do, you'll get some rewards. The biggest, most dramatic and most divisive change of all are the worms. Dune Uprising now comes with worms, which are a slightly stronger type of troop, which can be recruited for combat. They take a fair bit of thematic work to unleash, but they are worth it because they double the rewards that you get in the combat, including victory points. There's also a new way to score from combat, as the conflict cards have symbols on them, and they will go to the winning player. And then when a player has a matching pair of symbols, they can spend them in order to get a point. Lastly, there's the addition of a team game where 3 players take on 3 players, and everyone scores individually, but their combined score will determine which team will win. Dune Imperium, Rise of Ix, was the first expansion for Dune Imperium. It adds a whole bunch of new content, including new boards, cards, intrigue cards, combat units, and mechanisms. There are 3 main elements: technologies, dreadnoughts, and shipping. The technologies are tiles that you can buy for spice, which give you some special powers, and the dreadnoughts are a new type of combat unit, which are slightly stronger than troops, but with the added bonus that they go back to your garrison after a conflict instead of going back to your supply. The shipping track is a track that you can go up and then drop down on, gaining the rewards that you pass on the way down. To make room for all of this, you have 2 new boards, one of which sits in the top right corner of the board, covering up some of the spaces, and another which sits separately, shaking up the worker placement spaces. Some of the new cards do work in tandem with the new mechanisms, but for the most part, the cards can be thrown in without adding any of the other elements. The rules also introduce an epic game mode where you play to 12 points rather than 10, giving players more time to work on their decks and creating some really big combinations.
Dune Imperium Immortality was the second expansion, and this is going to add some new mechanisms. It's going to add new Imperium cards, new intrigue cards, and a new sideboard. Everything here is going to center around the Tlaxu board, and this comes with 2 different tracks. One, the Tlaxu track. This is just basically going to give you points. It's almost equivalent to the influence tracks for the different factions. Then you have a research track, and this is going to give you lots of rewards as you move along it. Many times it's going to let you send troops to the axolotl tanks, and here you can spend those troops when you have enough to do one of 3 things. You could move on the Tlaxu track, you could buy Tlaxu cards from a new deck that is kind of special and kept to the side and full of weird, wonderful things, or you could just garrison some troops. While most of the Tlaxu deck cards are obviously going to play with the new mechanisms, the rest of the cards, like in Rise of Ix, are a nice split between cards that address the new mechanisms and cards that you would never know weren't there from the beginning. One particularly interesting aspect that is introduced through the cards, a new mechanism, is the grafting mechanism, where certain cards will allow you to graft that card to another card, and they basically become one card in all senses, so you can use either of their symbols to send an agent to a space, and you'll get both the rewards for sending an agent to a space on both cards. That's a pretty nice little thing, and probably my favorite thing of all from this expansion is the Family Atomics token, which is a token you can use once per game to completely wipe the Imperium row of cards. So if there's nothing there for you, you'll get something better, hopefully. And I think this was something I was sorely missing in the base game. Interestingly, pretty much everything can be combined with everything, although it is much easier to combine the stuff from Dune Imperium into Uprising than the reverse, because Uprising has more mechanisms. However, to combine the stuff from Imperium into Uprising, all you really need to do is take out 1 or 2 cards which mention the Mentad, because that's not in Uprising, and you're pretty much good to go. You're also able to pretty much interchangeably use any of the character cards between the 2 games. Surprisingly, given that the expansions came out for Dune Imperium, they can both be used with Dune Uprising, and minor changes are needed, and also they can both be used together in either game if you're wondering. Immortality actually doesn't require any changes for Uprising, whereas the Rise of Ix has a few. For example, the new worker placement spaces it adds, they do not have spaces for spies, so you have to essentially pretend there are spies. You also don't use the full board overlay, you fold this one in half, and it only covers some of the board. However, because this will cover one of the spaces that allows you to gain the contracts seen in Dune Uprising, this means that you kind of start a little bit different. You start with a little special contract only for use with that expansion, which allows you to gain expansions, but otherwise the contracts are the same. The one area to be careful of when mixing and matching everything is the combat cards, because the ones in Dune Uprising, they have symbols that you're trying to match for points, whereas in Dune Imperium and the expansions, their combat cards do not have these because it wasn't a mechanism yet. So if you mix them up, you're making it a lot harder to make these pairs, and it could potentially favor one player over the other by pure randomness. So be careful of that. But what's really interesting about this weird mix 2.0 everything is that you can basically make your own game from the component pieces of all of this stuff. You can create your own Imperium deck, your own intrigue card deck, and you can just include the things that you want. And I find that super cool. And as soon as we're done finishing this video, I'm going to go and do that. The first and maybe most important thing you should know is that Dune Imperium and Dune Uprising are both games that should be played with 3 or 4 players optimally. Now, it's fine to play it too, and we've played a lot of it, we enjoy it, but you do require the use of an AI opponent, because otherwise the combat will become zero-sum, the spaces in the board will be too open, and it will just lose something without it. And obviously some people might not want to facilitate playing an AI, but it does run pretty quickly. You flip a card and send it to a space, maybe put some cubes in the combat. But just know that this game really shines when you have a full 3 or 4 players, all fighting very tensely for those 10 points. When it comes to complexity, neither game is that bad if you have some experience with board games. In fact, kind of mechanistically, it's a little on the lighter side because you have a very kind of standard worker placement mechanism and a very standard deck building mechanism just paired together. However, there is a lot to consider, and it's kind of you could say, the game state where the mental load comes from. But I definitely don't think it's a game that anyone should be scared of trying. What you should keep in mind is that this is a brutal, tight, tense kind of experience. It's quite interactive at times, with players sometimes being able to directly affect other players, impede their plans. So you need to make sure you like that kind of high interaction if you're thinking about getting this. When it comes to which version to get, Dune Uprising is generally considered superior to Dune Imperium because obviously it's 1.5 or 2.0, depending how you want to look at it. They've taken what they've learned from Dune Imperium and feedback and incorporated it. It's got a whole new set of cards, which are arguably more interesting. It's got a more interesting worker placement system with the spies. It's got new ways to get points. It's got altered spaces. But one thing to consider is that in Dune Imperium, it tended to be a bit tighter and more dramatic in terms of who won, because it was generally much closer up until the final battle, and that would be a big climactic decider. Whereas because of the worms in Uprising, doubling points, you often tend to get much more swing in where people are ranked, and you often will get a winner from around where people might be on 6 or 7 points, and then they go into combat with worms, they win, they double their points, they get some points from somewhere else, and suddenly someone's on 11 points and everyone else is on 6, 7 points. When it comes to the expansions, both are highly recommended and well liked. You'd be good with either and or both. They are also great expansions in terms that they don't necessarily increase the complexity of the game, but rather the decision space. They kind of expand it out sideways, giving players more options to go about the same exact goals. And I personally really enjoy them. The publisher Direwolf has a companion app available which covers both games. This could be used to facilitate the AI in solo or two-player games, but it also includes varying game modes. There's an Arakeen Scouts mode, which throws in special events throughout the game to shake things up, while the Blitz mode shortens the game, allowing players to gain Imperium cards into their starting deck, bet on who will win, and even start off with more resources and faction influence. It's, however, not required for normal play, not even solo two-player play, it's just there if you want it.
So now we're going to share with you what we think about the games. So I think it's fair to say we quite liked it when we first played Dune Imperium. We thought it was quite good. Maybe didn't jump in with the hype that everyone else was giving it in the praise, but we thought it was a very solid game. But perhaps this is because we were mostly playing at 2 players. Do you agree?
Yeah, I think I remember enjoying it enough, but not being wowed by it. And I remember when it broke the top 20 on BGG, and I was a bit like, I'm not sure I buy that. But I rewatched our review, which was around the time it came out, and we were pretty positive on it.
Yep.
And I think you're right. I think we played a lot of 2 players, and the game doesn't shine. And the more we've played with more, I think the more we've appreciated it. But I also think that Uprising has really thrown it into the spotlight for us and really made us appreciate it more. I just think the cards are more interesting, and that's kind of a core aspect of the game. Obviously, because you want to buy the cards, I just find them much more interesting. I think the new mechanisms are welcome ones. The spies are interesting. I think the spaces have been changed for the better. Yeah,
I think we've been really addicted to this since we first got it. And I agree, I feel like the kind of different powers and the way that you can approach things with the cards, it kind of lifts it up a little bit for me and elevates it. Although I will say in the first game or 2, I think I was preferring the first one because I wasn't so hot on the worms. Maybe we can talk about that. It's a bit of a contentious subject, as we touched upon, because basically they are pretty powerful because you can double your rewards if you use them in a combat. Now, they're not easy to get points. You do have to work for it, get influence with a certain faction, and you still have to kind of recruit them and go through some different steps to get the right resources and everything. But once you have them, they are very powerful. And if you set yourself up right, you could be getting 5 or 6 points in a single round if you manage to double victory points, which is a lot in this game. Like we said, everything does have to fall into place, but what it happened for me, you were doing it and I just found it a little bit demotivating basically, because I was then so far behind after you've had a good round, and it did kind of take the tension out of it a little bit, whereas I think we both like games where it is a bit more tense and there's more of a tight race to the end and it could be anyone's game. Whereas with the worms, someone can go out in front and you don't have a chance really to catch up basically. Yeah,
so I think the worms are just very, very contentious overall, because the original Dune Imperium was a very popular tournament game. People playing this a lot, they're playing for money. And I know the worms in particular have not been well received in terms of how they change up the gameplay. But then there are a lot of other people who have played it a bunch and say after a certain point, the worms aren't as powerful as they appear, and you can counter them. So there's a lot of back and forth. I think going on to probably another thing that we didn't like so much in Dune Uprising is for 2 players, the AI players. They try and make them so that they're basically you have a range of ones that act like a player. And we kind of don't want someone, this is a personal thing, but we don't want someone to act like a player. We just want them to get in the way a little bit and, facilitate the gameplay for us to go
make
head
it a bit tighter.
And they tended to have this ability in this one, because you can play with ones that don't do that and they just kind of act like the original. But their special power is always to throw troops in. And so many times in a single game, they would get ridiculous amount of troops in, and we would only maybe win a combat like once, twice a game each, which, we weren't even competitive, which isn't how it is in, you could say, when you play with 3 or 4 players. I think what's important is, I think we can take or leave the worms with 3 or 4 players because it's players doing it, but when it's with this bot, it was a lot more hard to take, I think. But there are also a lot of people having house rules, like, I think a very popular one is to take, when you have worms in the combat, rather than doubling what you get, you take whatever the 3rd place offering is on top of what you get.
Yeah.
And that might be something we do with the AI, but I think with other players, we're fine with it.
Yeah, I got more used to it in the end. I was like, fair is fair. It's just the first couple of games where I was still getting to grips with the cards and the way that you can play here. Yeah, it was just a bit annoying. Yeah, I guess it's just sometimes like not every conflict card will give you VP, and some, it is good to obviously get spice or money or whatever other reward, but obviously you're going for victory points, so it could just be kind of a little bit luck. If you can put a worm into the combat on the round where there's victory points, you might be able to more easily with the hand that you have, do it on a round where there isn't victory points in the combat. So it is I don't want to say it's luck based, because of course you have to curate your deck in the right way, but it is worker placement after all, and somebody could just take the space that you need to go to in order to put a worm in, and then you're like done for.
I think we touched on it a little bit earlier in the video, but I think what we don't like most of all is the fact that in Dune Imperium, the games were very tense and tight, going very close to the wire. And here it can just be a big swing. Not every game, but it can. But it sounds like we didn't like it. But overall, I think it was, we really prefer this. So turning to the expansions, we basically don't have so much to say. They're both excellent. We both really enjoy them. We like how they make the game open up kind of laterally rather than making it more complex. It just, you have the same exact goals and you play the same exact way. It's just that now you have these alternate routes that are
more options,
fun
basically
to go into.
Yeah. You can just ignore some of them if you really want. Like sometimes I didn't go down like the scientific track and you did. You can still absolutely win. You can just kind of lean into whatever kind of suits your deck, I guess. But it's not like you have to kind of interact with them all, but you can if you want.
Yeah, so honestly, just if you look at them, if they interest you, I'd say just get them. There's not a lot to say. They just really are great expansions. And I think final thing to touch upon is obviously what should you get? How should you go about it? I don't think anyone now is really going to recommend that you start with Dune Imperium. I think you should always go with Dune Uprising. It's a better re-implementation. It's got better aspects to it. You can even use the expansions with it. But if you already had Dune Imperium, I would say there's an argument for getting this because you do get a lot of new content and it does improve a lot of things.
Yeah.
You get the 6-player game. But that's more of a personal preference. I think I'm really looking forward to combining everything. And I definitely think that we would still occasionally want to go back to Dune Imperium. We actually did it very recently and had a couple of games of it, just the base game. And it is a different feel and cadence in some ways.
Yeah. I think it's just like the way that you can approach things because of the kind of powers that are in there is just different.
Yeah.
Right? Even though the core gameplay is the same. It's funny because, like I said, when we first played this one, I found the worm thing a little bit annoying and frustrating. But then I got over it and I found this one like more and more interesting the more that we went through the deck, the more we saw the different cards. And actually, when we went back to this one the other day, it did feel a little bit more flat for me. So then that really solidified that I do prefer Uprising.
So I think that will end the buyer's guide there. We just want to say that we appreciate you watching. We really hope it was helpful. And if it was, please consider subscribing because it helps us grow our channel and it really does help us make more of these, especially when we can liaise with publishers for the bigger ones. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask. Just write them down below and we will answer them if you have any questions about any of this. And we just really appreciate you watching. We'll see you in the future with some other buyer's guides, or you can check out our already existing ones. We're also on some social medias, Threads, Instagram. So check us out there as well if you want some less long, bite-sized, bored of it type things. See ya.
Bye.